All right, our last class of the semester, at least with new material, is going to be looking at the letters of John Keats as literary criticism. I mentioned Shelley last class, and then I realized actually I didn't have Shelley on the syllabus, and probably because I'm not a huge fan. But also I just thought at the end of the semester, although Shelley's very interesting because he's writing a defense of poetry and he's explicitly evoking the work by Spencer that we looked at earlier, or not Spencer, Sidney, Sir Philip Sidney, and using much the same language and terminology, and responding to the Four Ages of Poetry by his friend Peacock, which in some ways, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I could have included on the course and didn't, and I'm always sort of torn about it. And I'll just say a few words about the Shelley defense there. He is responding to the idea, which I've already enunciated, which I think remains a strong sense, that the earliest writing was that of an age of poetry, in which language was emotional and expressive and vivid and powerful and poetic. And the earliest documents reflect that, and even the oral tradition reflects that. And there's something more true to human nature in that poetry. So when Wordsworth in his preface to Lyrical Ballads speaks in this form, he to some degrees is tapping into the idea that poetry is of a sort of a primal nature, which, as we saw last time, Coleridge not only didn't agree with, he thought was untenable. But he is, to some degree, throwing himself in with that view of poetry as an expressive, emotional, and to some degree almost pre-rational type of writing. That gives way to the age of philosophy. So they'll argue that first comes the age of the poets, which is also a religious age, per se, which doesn't quite fit. But and then we get Plato critiquing Homer and the poets, and now it begins an age of philosophy, in which the poetic images that have been cast by the poets are now being scrutinized by the philosopher and found wanting. That gives way to an age of religion, explaining the church, and the age of all the way up to the Middle Ages, in which church doctrine is to some degree inheriting the successes of the philosophical tradition, but adding sort of a poetic cladding to that. But that gives way finally to the age of science, in which there's a sort of a philosophical impulse, which is scrutinizing this again. And we're now in the scientific age, and therefore Peacock somewhat seriously, somewhat disingenuously says that there's no need for poetry anymore. And so Percy Shelley responds by arguing that all ages have employed poetry, not just a long past age was poetic, but poetry has always been the primary impulse. And he concludes his great work with the phrase that the poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That's his rather sweeping phrase. The unacknowledged legislators of the world, because he will say that Jesus is a poet as well, and so was Moses, and so was Plato, and so was Solon, the lawgiver of ancient Greece, and so forth. And so he'll list a long number. He'll also Lord Bacon, so Francis Bacon, a prose writer. These are all poets according to Shelley. So rather than it's defined to an age and an era, and it's no longer of use, and it no longer really speaks to human needs, Shelley defends it as a universal human trait, and one that had given language and vital language to all ages and all times. So it's quite a famous treatise, and I am sorry that it's not on the course to some degree. But again, it's more for lack of space than anything else. But that's his view, and he gets into something of the same language that we inherit about a rational age and a feeling age. So there's an age of reason and there's the age of poetry. So he talks about ta logodzane and ta poieing, the Greek words. So there's a thinking rational mind, and then there's a poetic mind. And it's from Shelley that we probably get this idea that the Romantic period is marked by feeling and the Enlightenment by reasoning. It's not only Shelley, but he's expressing that. Wordsworth does that to some degree as well. You don't get the same sense when you read Coleridge. So even though these are all Romantic theorists, and in Keats we're going to look at a fourth, there are fairly significant differences amongst them. And that's one of the reasons why I've dealt with, or we're going to deal with at least three of them, because the three are also very influential on successive generations. And I said the reason I was thinking about putting Shelley on there is because Shelley, as a poet, was not considered an important poet historically. In the critical tradition, he was regarded as largely ineffectual as a poet. He created beautiful images, but they didn't really mean anything. And so he was neglected, although he's very influential in terms of poetics on the Victorian period. He was much liked. Shelley, he was not received as one of the canonical poets in the English tradition until really the 1960s. And then come the 1960s, Percy Shelley takes on huge significance in the Academy. And it's largely because his view of language fits the view of language which starts to be adopted in the Academy, namely that of the post-structuralists. Language falls apart. And deconstructionists. And so my doctoral supervisor, Timothy Clark, wrote his doctoral work on Percy Shelley and connected it with these aspects. So there's a revolutionary poetics, which includes his view of language and so forth. And Tim is one of Britain's foremost deconstructionist critics. And so, and Shelley is really an important author for that because of the way his poetry works. So with that in mind, next semester when we come to deconstruction and post-structuralism and the idea of the death of the author, I'll be hinting at Shelley as the test case for this, the proof of that. But I'm not going to deal with that today. We're going to deal with Keats and his letters. And Keats has been also influential on the literary establishment and the development of literature and its understanding of what it is, in large part not because he wrote a treatise, but because his letters have been viewed as statements on poetry. And we're going to read some of his letters, and I think you'll find that he is, in fact, writing not just letters, but I guess we would call them epistles. If you were with me in the Bible as literature, I suggested that, everyone can write a letter. In social media, with cell phones, we send texts and so forth. There's a form of communication. But a letter, and specifically an epistle, has a literary form. And in Keats's case, he is writing people personal notes, but he is including in those letters things which almost nobody would ever include in a letter, which are his views and beliefs about poetry and its nature. And were preserved and published as sort of manifestos. So that's why we're taking it, reading them that way. And again, the letters of John Keats are produced in editions on their own and taken as statements about poetics. And they do say something about the features of Romantic poetics. And let me just say one final thing. We looked at Wordsworth and Coleridge and their theories, and these are considered in the Romantic period. These are first generation Romantics. And there are three of them there, or at least three primary writers there. It will be Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Blake. Blake has his own view of the imagination and his own view of what poetry does. And it is like the others in the sense that he emphasizes the imagination. They all seem to emphasize the imagination. It's a real watchword for the period. So whenever you think imagination, it is used by other authors, and it's significant to them. It's important in Shakespeare, for example, but it doesn't have the same sort of importance as it does come the Romantics. They really emphasize the imagination. But for all that unifying character, there's a lot of difference between them. And Blake's theory of poetics seems to be a little bit unusual, and it doesn't really fit the others, not quite. But he himself is important because when you come to the later 20th century, the great Canadian critic Northrop Frye, the great Canadian literary establishment figure, writes his principal work on Blake. And it was William Blake that said that the Bible was the great code of Western art. So it's a way of looking at Scripture. It's a way that actually, it sounds to me, I mean, I haven't watched everything that he puts out there, and who could, but what Jordan Peterson has been talking about when he's reading Scripture, he's reading it as sort of archetypes, primal human experiences being expressed in stories and so forth. That's Blake to some degree, and to a lesser extent, although Carl Jung, who is influencing Frye and influencing Peterson. Peterson regularly references the psychologist Carl Jung and his theory of archetypes. We'll come to Frye next semester. But Blake's an influence there. So all of these Romantic authors have big significance come the 20th century, and literary theory arise from them or in response to them. Keats doesn't seem to have a school that comes out of him in the same way. Shelley probably gives way to deconstruction. Blake, maybe you could argue, gives to Frye's sort of archetypal formalism. Keats, maybe we would associate him with, I don't even know. But he is influential in various phrases. So I'll look at some of them, and then I'll talk in greater detail about them. Oh, I probably need to put these on the screen because you don't even have them. Are they in the book that you've got? Or have you got nothing by Keats? Okay. I was wondering about that. Where Shelley is in there, right? Okay, well, I'll put it up on the screen. And then I'll say more. But he writes these, so Keats, let's say a little bit about Keats himself. Keats was in some ways, the best poet of the period, showed the greatest promise at an early age, and died, sadly, at a very tender age. How old was he? I'm always terrible at biography. So 25, 26? I should know this. I do know it, but I forget details like this. Obviously, they're not important enough to me, or I'd remember them. That's John Clare. Gosh, there's not much John Clare here. 1795 to 1821, 26, as I said. He dies at 25, and he dies of what? Tuberculosis, which he also saw his brother die from. And he's an interesting character because his poetry meditates very much on the same themes and ideas that the rest of the Romantics write on. So namely on the nature of poetry, its connection with nature, its connection with genius, its connection with vital language and the imagination. But he meditates more on death than most of them. And if you look at his biography, it pretty much explains it. He not only saw his brother and many in his his beloved die of tuberculosis. He himself died of it, and he also served and he was, by the way, an orphan. And he served as a surgeon's apprentice. And surgeons in Keats's day were not surgeons the way they are in our day. Surgeons had a function, and that was to cut off limbs. So they don't have antibiotics, right? If you get an infection, gangrene sets in. If you don't stop it, it kills you. So the solution to the problem is to take off the limb that's infected. And the surgeon comes in with his saw or his cleaver. Nice. Yeah. So are you going to lose a limb or are you going to lose your life? That's the choice there, pretty much. And so he, serving in that capacity, you can imagine a man of vivid sensibilities such as he was, serving as a surgeon's apprentice, what he would have seen, a lot of suffering, a lot of death and horrible things. He gave that up, by the way, and ended up, so his father died in a riding accident, his mother died of TB. His brother died of TB, he died of TB. Unlike the other poets also, aside from Blake, he grew up in London. So in the midst of cities. I like John Keats. I've always liked Keats, although I always think his name's sort of funny because it's Keats and not Cates, and it's Yeats and not Keat and not Yeats. And they're spelled the same. English language is tough, right? Try explaining that to a foreigner. It's Keats and it's Yeats. Okay. It's just the Irish. Blame the Irish, right? But he writes these poems, and what he wants to create is a poetry of sensibility. And he, to some degree, I don't want to give too much on this, but he is almost Aristotelian in his sense of the form of goodness and beauty and truth being in the particular. Whereas in Wordsworth, nature almost seems to disappear and seems to have this transcendent quality, so that although I said it's called natural supernaturalism, you're reading about the natural landscape and it almost like the landscape is less important than the idea of the landscape. With Keats, there's a vividness and a concreteness, and again, almost Aristotelian emphasis on the form within the particular. Again, when Aristotle disputes the theory of forms, he's not suggesting there are no universal things. It is that he is, go away. It is that he's disputing Plato's idea of what that is. Keats and what is this? Letters. Selection of Keats letters. Well, hopefully it's the right selection here. I hate this Poetry Foundation. It's got this enormous thing at the top. It's actually a very good website, but it's not useful for my classroom. And this is probably too fancy as well. It looks like it's got all sorts of stuff. Go away. No, it's far too fancy. I just want the letters. That's it. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So, I won't bother with that for the people watching this. That's too bad. So we're going to first look at, which one do I want to look at? I believe it's yes. So the first one I'm going to look at is a letter to November 22nd, 1817 to Benjamin Bailey. November 22nd, 1817. Oh, I'm going to have to blow that up a bit for you. Can you read that? Is that okay? Is that visible at the back? Or do I need to make it one bigger? So this is to Benjamin Bailey. I will get over the first part of this letter as soon as possible, for it relates to the affair of poor Cripps, is a mutual acquaintance. So you're going to find there's a lot of personal, obvious he's talking to this man, but then he starts talking, he'll move and start talking about things that we don't need to know anything of personal acquaintance. He's talking in universal terms. So he starts it off, and it is just a letter at that point. He's a man of your nature. Such a letter as Haydn's must have been extremely cutting. Now Haydn, Benjamin Robert Haydn, to whom he refers here, was a cultural critic, an art critic, and wrote on the painting of the period and the sublimity of it, and it was a defender of the sublimity in the Greek sense, the sublime in art. And Haydn is obviously criticizing this man Cripps, whom I don't know. But then he says, what occasions the greater part of the world's quarrels? Simply this: two minds meet and do not understand each other enough to prevent any shock or surprise at the conduct of either party. As soon as I had known Haydn 3 days, I'd got enough of his character not to have been surprised at such a letter as he has hurt you with. Nor when I knew it was a principle with me to drop his acquaintance, although with you it would have been an imperious feeling. I wish you knew all that I think about genius and the heart. And yet I think you are thoroughly acquainted with my innermost breast in that respect, or you could not have known me even thus long and still hold me worthy to be your dear friend. In passing, however, I must say of one thing that has pressed upon me lately and increased my humility and capability of submission, and that is this truth. Men of genius are great as certain ethereal chemicals operating on the mass of neutral intellect. But they have not any individuality, any determined character. I would call the top and head of those who have a proper self men of power, whereas the poet's the opposite. So he's already talking about the genius as not having a determined character. Now this is important for what follows here, but the poet is presented as a passive figure, whereas the men of power are active figures. So the passivity of the poet in receiving all things indiscriminately, that's going to be key for what follows here. Now, it's a funny emphasis. You're not going to see it in periods before this. He's operating under the influence of associationist psychology, where the ideas of things are related by atoms relating to other atoms, and we connect them two together, and that creates the imaginative idea, and the imagination unites the discordant impressions. This is John Locke's psychology that is bringing him to this conclusion. But the idea that the poet is a passive figure who doesn't have a worldview which he brings to bear on the text, this comes out of the Enlightenment period. It's inconceivable for Sir Philip Sidney to think this, or the ancient world. Horace would never have said this, neither Aristotle nor Plato. They have an idea that there are forms that underlie these things, but not for him. The poetic sensibility is like, as they say, ethereal chemicals operating on the mass of neutral intellect. Note that they're ethereal. So it's a spiritual process. But the language here is almost like a chemistry experiment. T.S. Eliot, when he writes on poetics, uses similar sorts of language. But anyway, we'll come to that next semester as well. But he says, I'm running my head again into a subject which I am certain I could not do justice to under 5 years study and 3 volumes octavo, and moreover long to be talking about the imagination. That's what I really want to talk about. So, my dear Bailey, do not think of this unpleasant affair if possible. Do not. I defy any harm to come of it. I shall write to Cripps this week and request him to tell me all his goings on from time to time by letter, wherever I may be. It will all go on well. So don't, because you have suddenly discovered a coldness in Haydn, suffer yourself to be teased. Do not, my dear fellow. So he cares. He's a very good friend in my sense. Keats is a good guy. I think we would love Keats. But then he moves on down this, a few lines down. And it's here. Oh, I wish I could be as certain of the end of all your troubles as that of your momentary start about the authenticity of the imagination. I am certain, and these are famous lines, I am certain of nothing but of the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. What the imagination seizes as beauty must be truth, whether it existed before or not. For I have the same idea of all our passions as of love. They are all in their sublime, creative of essential passions. Is that not the word? Creative essential beauty, rather. In a word, you may know my favorite speculation by my first book and the little song I sent in my list, which is a representation from the fancy of the probable mode of operating in these matters. And here it is. The imagination may be compared to Adam's dream. What did he dream of? He dreamed that there was a woman running away from him. And he's not referring to the Bible, by the way. Now he's referring to Milton, the account that he gives in Paradise Lost, which for him was effectively more powerful than the Bible. Keats read Milton over and over and over again. And so Adam's dream, he awoke and found it truth. So he imagined that there was a woman in the garden running away from him. He woke up and lo and behold, it was. I am the more zealous in this affair because I've never yet been able to perceive how anything can be known for truth by consecutive reasoning. And yet it must be. Again, the imaginative mind baffled by the philosophical way of looking at things and approaching it. Can it be that even the greatest philosopher ever arrived at his goal without putting aside numerous objections, however it may be, oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts? It is a vision in the form of youth, a shadow of the reality to come. And this consideration had further convinced me, for it has come as auxiliary to another favorite speculation of mine, that we shall enjoy ourselves hereafter by having what we call happiness on earth repeated in a finer tone and so repeated. And yet, such a fate can only befall those who delight in sensation rather than hunger as you do after truth. Adam's dream will do here, and seems to be a conviction that imagination and its imperial reflection is the same as human life and its spiritual repetition. Note how he's playing on the words and the ideas that are used by previous critics. There's a sort of a mimesis, there's an imitation, there's a reflection, and yet he's flipping it around, not in the Kantian sense of things in accordance with our capacity to perceive them, but really connecting more with sensations even. So the Kant's view is still to some degree, to my mind, disembodied, whereas Keats is very much embodied. So his poetry is highly sensual, talks about the taste of things and the smell of things, as well as the sight of them and the sound of them. But he employs all five senses in a way that most poets don't. So it's highly sensual. And in that, it's talking about not just the materialist sense of sensation, but gives a spiritual significance to it. But as I was saying, the simple imaginative mind may have as its rewards in the repetition of its own silent working, coming continually on the spirit with a fine suddenness to compare great things with small. Have you never been surprised? Have you never, by being surprised with an old melody in a delicious place, by a delicious voice, felt over again your very speculation and surmises at the time it first operated on your soul? Do you not remember forming to yourself the singer's face, more beautiful than it was possible, and yet with the elevation of the moment you did not think so? Even then you were mounted on the wings of imagination so high that the prototype must be hereafter. That delicious face you will see. What a time! I am continually running away from the subject. Sure, this cannot be exactly the case with a complex mind, one that is imaginative and at the same time careful of its fruits. That won't happen when there's a conscious reflection. It must be enjoying the moment, delighting in the moment. It must perceive the beauty and the goodness and the truth in the perception and not reflect on whether it's possible. There's no critical spirit. So now he's going to contrast the poetic mind with the philosophic mind. And by that in mind, although he is in that reference here to the philosophic mind, he's actually echoing Wordsworth's ode, intimations of immortality, years that breed the philosophic mind. But he says, such an one I consider yours, and therefore it is necessary to your eternal happiness that you not only drink this old wine of heaven, which I call the redigestion of our most ethereal musings on earth, but also increase in knowledge and know all things. I am glad to hear you are in a fair way for Easter. You will soon get through your unpleasant reading, and then, but the world is full of troubles, and I have not much reason to think myself pestered with many. And then he concludes and moves off and talks about worldly happiness and so forth. But I'll move on from that. Then he follows this famous letter, with a letter to his brothers, George and Tom. And I believe it should come right after this. Oh, no, it hasn't. Why is that? Oh, no, there it is. No, it's not. Okay, so let me go back to the beginning. George and Tom Keats. There it is. Oh, wonder what's going on there. This can't be right. This is not right. So I wonder what I don't know, it's a problem when the dating of this is not that. Let's see. I wonder if they've dated it differently here. I'll try this. I think this must be right. It's not. Oh, man. Okay. My dear brothers, oh God, go away. I must crave your pardon for not having written ere this. I saw Kean return to the public in Richard III, and finally he did it. Kean was the great Shakespearean actor of his day. Famous. Keats, we used to go and watch him, and he loved Kean, a fantastic actor. And he loved Shakespeare and Milton and Spenser, but Shakespeare and Milton in particular, but Kean, and he reflects on Kean regularly in his letters. I saw Kean return to the public in Richard III, and finally he did it. And at the request of Reynolds, I went to criticize his Luke in Riches. The critique is in today's Champion. So he wrote a review. And then he goes on about a few lines down. I spent Friday evening with Wells and went the next morning to see Death on the Pale Horse. It is a wonderful picture when West's age is considered, but there's nothing to be intense upon. Where is it? In my own notes. Nothing to be intense upon. No woman one feels mad to kiss. No face swelling into reality. The excellence, and here's the famous phrase, the excellence of every art is its intensity, capable of making all disagreeables evaporate from their being in close proximity with beauty and truth. So again, he seems to be talking about Platonic forms. He's even using the language of beauty and truth. And yet his access to that is by the means of material things. And it gives rise to that, but in an uncritical spirit. The critical mind, the philosophic mind, doesn't allow us to experience them as they actually are. But he says, examine King Lear and you will find this exemplified throughout. But in this picture we have unpleasantness without any momentous depth of speculation excited, in which to bury its repulsiveness. The picture is larger than Christ rejected. I dined with Haydn the Sunday after you left, and had a very pleasant day. I dined too with Horace Smith and his two brothers, etc., etc. They talked of Kean and his low company. Would I were with that company instead of yours, said I to myself. I know such like acquaintance will never do for me, and yet I am going to Reynolds on Wednesday. Brown and Dilke, friends of his, walked with me and back from the Christmas pantomime. Do you know what a Christmas pantomime is? Pantomime is a British tradition in which the aristocrats put on clothing in the guise of the commoners, and it's sort of there's a bogeyman that appears, and everyone in the audience participates in it, sort of like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and everyone cries out, the guy comes behind and everyone goes, behind you! And there are little stock phrases and so forth. Anyway, it's called the panto or the pantomime. Remember, it's in Hamlet as well, but it's a Christmas tradition in Britain. I acted in it a few times myself. And there's photo evidence, unfortunately. I haven't managed to burn them yet. Me with cigarette in mouth and all sorts of... Anyway, never mind. But he said that he went to a Christmas pantomime, and I had not a dispute but a disquisition with Dilke on various subjects. This is the important bit. Oh, let me just pop it up further on the screen here. On various subjects, several things dovetailed in my mind. And it at once struck me. What quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously? I mean negative capability. This is his famous phrase. That is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, would let go by a fine, isolated verisimilitude caught from the penetralium of mystery from being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So the great poet, so he's talking about a poetic sensibility, which he says Shakespeare possesses, the negative capability. So this is how he explains the fact that nobody knows what Shakespeare thought about anything. He had this capacity for writing credible figures into his plays. And you would have thought that Shakespeare agreed with the character because he presented them so plausibly. And yet then you will find that he presented another character equally plausibly and equally approvingly in some sense. He seems to delight in his own creations and not impose his own intellect or his own worldview on it. This is what he describes as Shakespeare's great gift. It's this capacity to negate himself. Now, when you come to the 20th century, T.S. Eliot will talk about this as well. And the need for an impersonal poetry, by which he's talking about he's getting rid of the problem of objectivism or subjectivism. It's not me just telling you what I think, and it's not me imposing my views. I want to remove the author's identity from the play. This is his reading of Shakespeare, Keats' reading of Shakespeare. I think that there's some substance to the description, at least in the sense of creating believable characters. Another who's tremendous at doing this is Charles Dickens. The characters leap off the page. Memorable figures. And there's a great gift, and it's probably what Aristotle talked about, the love of drama, what all people by nature love to imitate, and they love to see imitations. They take great delight in it, and they'd like to see something very precisely being described or come to life. There's great delight in that. So what Keats is talking about seems to be very much in the Aristotelian spirit when he comments on that. But on the other hand, what is not is his, I almost want to say his theologizing of it, because it almost is approaching that. The reason he gives for it is because it articulates beauty and truth. And you'll remember what we said back in the medieval period about the early, that medieval institution, which we call the university, beginning with ideas about the unity of beauty, truth, and goodness in God. And then the question being, are these real things or are they just names? So there's the universal, the realists, and then there are the nominalists on the other hand. And disputing, are these just terms that we use to describe this, or can we really know them as they are? That debate begins there and it doesn't go away. By the way, if you want an interesting read over the Christmas break, which will help you set for the second semester if you're taking it, read Richard M. Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences, in which he reads the entirety of modern culture as a debate between those two schools. We have the nominalists, nomen, the Latin word for name, who thought that they were just the names but not the essence of the things, and then the realists that thought that the names grasped something of the essence of things. He sees that as a contemporary decline is in when the nominalists start to hold sway, and the world as we live in it starts to lose its hold on reality. He sees it in a broad canvas. It's just a very interesting hypothesis. I think there's something to it, and he writes it well. But Keats seems to be talking about it. Where does Keats stand on this? It's not entirely clear. I don't think he's philosophical enough to give us any impression. Is he a nominalist or is he a realist? I would say that, going back to Shelley, I think Shelley is a nominalist. He says very explicitly in one of his letters on life that the words I, you, they are merely names that we use to describe things, but they don't reflect the particular things. They're just names that we use customarily, but they don't actually identify discrete objects. To me, then, he's a nominalist, and he's a skeptic. And right? Whereas Keats does not seem to be saying that. He seems to be more of a realist. That there's something truly, but the realism is, and there it pulls him closer to Aristotle. The realism is in the things. The things are real, and there's a universality to the particulars, which Plato disputes. Whereas, and so Shakespeare is capable of this negative capability. He doesn't have to interrupt all the time and think and reflect, and is this right? And let's look at this angle and parse it out, and let me think deeply about it. Whereas Coleridge is he can't seem to stop himself, and that kills off his ability to write poetry. He can't remain content with half knowledge. He has to know everything exhaustively. Famous passage. Shelley's poem's out, and there are words about it being objected to as much as Queen Mab was. Poor Shelley. I think he has his quota of good qualities. In sooth, la. Write soon to your most sincere friend and affectionate brother, John. Your comments or thoughts on that before I move on to another one. Yes?
We read John Keats to Skylark.
Oh, to a Skylark?
Yeah, and I thought...
Or to a Skylark, yes.
I thought that one, he seems more platonic.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's like the Skylark's going up and then he gets to the point and then he goes down. So I thought maybe Keats maybe go more on that side. Maybe, I don't
He does seem more in the Platonic school, but he ascribes far too much truth to the particulars for Plato's liking. Plato would never tolerate that, right? Plato describes these things, the visible world, as shadows of the forms. I mean, and then the artistic depictions of them on the wall of the cave, these are shadows of shadows, right? And Keats is not going to have that. He thinks that it's not just the idea is not enough. It's actually the vivid sensation, the life of sensations, which he thinks have a universality to that. So he's really a sensationalist, if you will, in a different sense than is commonly used, right? Sensationalism is trying to appeal to people's emotions for bad reasons. That's not what he means. He seems to think that there's the world in which we live and move and have our being, the experiences have a universal significance. It's a very theological way of looking at things in some ways. He's really ascribing a legitimacy to the world in which we live in a way that no Platonist seems to do. Remember, Plato regards the body as a prison house for the soul, right? So he's a Gnostic in some ways, or he gives the foundation for Gnosticism. And Keats is the opposite of a Gnostic. Although when you collapse the natural and the supernatural, where does that leave you? This is the intellectual problem with Keats. But he's writing as a poet rather than a critic, and yet he's engaging in the critical debate. If we want to go on, I wonder if it says anything. No, it won't be here, but about the... Oh, now I found it. Of course I find it now. What do I want to look at next? Other comments or questions? Observations at this point? Okay, so in that case, I'm going to read his letter to J.H. Reynolds, Tynemouth, T-E-I-G-N, mouth, 3rd of May, 1818. My dear Reynolds, what I complain of is that I've been in so uneasy a state of mind as not to be fit to write to an invalid. I cannot write to any length under disguised feeling. I should have loaded you with an edition of gloom, which I am sure you do not want. I am now, thank God, in a humor to give you a good groat's worth. For Tom, after a night without a wink of sleep and overburdened with fever, has got up after a refreshing day sleep and is better than he's been for a long time. And you, I trust, have been again around the common without any effect but refreshment. Were I to study physic, or rather medicine again, I feel it would not make the least difference in my poetry. When the mind is in its infancy, a bias is in reality a bias. But when we have acquired more strength, a bias becomes no bias. That's interesting. Every department of knowledge we see, and as we see excellent and calculated towards a great whole. I'm so convinced of this that I'm glad at not having given away my medical books, which I shall again look over to keep alive the little I know thitherwards, and more intend, through you and Rice, to become a sort of pip civilian, amateur lawyer. I'll skip over that phrase and move to the discussion of Hamlet. Okay, so an extensive knowledge is needful to thinking people. Extensive knowledge is needful to thinking people. Where is this? And then the fragment to the mind. Do I really want to read that? No, I don't want to read that. I want to go on a bit. I'll go after it. Yeah, you may be anxious. Perhaps be anxious to know for fact to what sense in your letter I allude. You say, I fear there is a little chance of anything else in this life. You seem by that to have been going through with a more painful and acute zest the same labyrinth that I have. I have come to the same conclusion thus far. My branchings out therefrom have been numerous. One of them is the consideration of Wordsworth's genius. And as a help, in the manner of gold being the meridian line of worldly wealth, how he differs from Milton. And here I have nothing but surmises, from an uncertainty, whether Milton's apparently less anxiety for humanity proceeds from his seeing further or no than Wordsworth. And whether Wordsworth has, in truth, epic passion and martyrs himself to the human heart, the main region of his song, to quote the Wordsworth's prospectus. He speaks about his epic subject matter, which is the human heart. In regard to his genius alone, we find that what he says, true as far as we have experienced, and we can judge no further, but by larger experience. And then a famous phrase, for axioms in philosophy are not axioms until they are proved upon our pulses. Just think about that. An axiom is not true until we've experienced it and known. Almost speaking like a scientist here. We read fine things, but never feel them to the full until we've gone the same steps as the author. I know this is not plain. You will know exactly my meaning when I say that now I shall relish Hamlet more than I ever have done. Or better, you are sensible no man can set down venery as a bestial or joyless thing until he's sick of it. And therefore all philosophizing on it would be mere wording. Until we are sick, we understand not. In fine, as Byron says, knowledge is sorrow. And I go on to say that sorrow is wisdom. And further, for aught we can know, for certainty, wisdom is folly. So you see how I have run away from Wordsworth and Milton and shall still run away from what was in my head, to observe that some kind of letters are good squares, others handsome ovals, and others some orbicular, others spheroid, and why should there not be another species with two rough edges like a rat trap? I hope you will find all my long letters of that species. And all will be well. He's got a good sense of humor. All will be well. For by merely touching the spring delicately and ethereally, so rat traps, it's got, the mouse trap where you get the cheese and it's got I don't know if you ever had a mouse trap like that and it comes down and whacks it. Yeah, okay. So the rough edge will fly immediately into a proper compactness, and thus you can make a good wholesome loaf with your own leaven in it of my fragments. If you cannot find this said rat trap sufficiently tractable, alas for me, it being an impossibility in grain for my ink to stain otherwise, etc. So he goes on and on with that, and then he moves to this, his description of the afterlife. So I must go from Hazlitt to Patmore and make Wordsworth and Coleman play at leapfrog, or keep them from Gray to Gay, from Little to Shakespeare. And then he comes to the passage that I want to look at with you. Have you not seen a gull, or an orc, or a seamew, or anything to bring this line to a proper length? And also fill up this one clear part, that like the gull I may dip, I hope not out of sight, and also like a gull I hope to be lucky in a good-sized fish. This crossing a letter is not without its association, for checker work leads us naturally to a milkmaid to Hogarth, Hogarth to Shakespeare, Shakespeare to Hazlitt, Hazlitt to Shakespeare, and thus by merely pulling an apron string, we set a pretty peal of chimes at work. Let them chime on while, with your patience, I will return to Wordsworth. So here it is. Whether or not he has an extended vision or a circumscribed grandeur, whether he's an eagle in his nest or on the wing. And to be more explicit, and to show you how tall I stand by the giant, I will put down a simile of human life as far as I now perceive it. That is, to the point to which I say we both have arrived at. Well, I compare human life to a large mansion of many apartments. Think of Jesus' description of heaven here. It's obvious allusion. Two of which I can only describe, the doors of the rest being as yet shut upon me. The first we step into we call the infant or thoughtless chamber. Remember in Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, he talks about when he was young, it was the years of thoughtless youth, when there was no reflection. The infant or thoughtless chamber in which we remain as long as we do not think. We remain there a long while, and notwithstanding the doors of the second chamber remain wide open, showing a bright appearance. But you can also think about Plato's cave. And there's a progress being made as we become adults. At that stage, showing a bright appearance, we care not to hasten to it, but are at length imperceptibly impelled by the awakening of the thinking principle within us. We no sooner get into the second chamber, which I call the chamber of maiden thought, then we become intoxicated with the light and the atmosphere. We see nothing but pleasant wonders and think of delaying there forever in delight. However, among the effects this breathing is father of is that tremendous one of sharpening one's vision into the heart and nature of man, of convincing one's nerves that the world is full of misery and heartbreak, sin, pain, sickness, and oppression, whereby this chamber of maiden thought becomes gradually darkened, and at the same time, on all sides of it, many doors are set open, but all dark, all leading to dark passages. We see not the balance of good and evil. We are in a mist. We are now in that state. We feel the burden of the mystery. To this point was Wordsworth come, as far as I can conceive when he wrote Tintern Abbey. And it seems to me that his genius is explorative of those dark passages. Now, if we live and go on thinking, we too shall explore them. He is a genius and superior to us insofar as he can, more than we, make discoveries and shed light in them. Here, I must think Wordsworth is deeper than Milton, though I think it has depended more upon, and here now we get the Whig theory of history. You know what I mean by the Whig theory of history, of human progress, intellectual pride, the grand march, though I think more dependent on the general and gregarious advance of intellect than individual greatness of mind. From the Paradise Lost and other works of Milton, I hope it is not too presuming, even between ourselves to say, his philosophy, human and divine, may be tolerably understood by one not much advanced in years. In his time, Englishmen were just emancipated from a great superstition, Catholicism. And men had got hold of certain points and resting places in reasoning which were too newly born to be doubted and too much opposed by the mass of Europe not to be thought ethereal and authentically divine. Who could gainsay his ideas on virtue, vice, and chastity in Comus, a masque, one of his early plays devoted to chastity, just at the time of the dismissal of codpieces and 100 other disgraces? You know what the codpiece is, right? This big projection on me, right? So this is the time of, he's talking about chastity and he's saying this is a good thing, and in the time of codpieces it probably seems so, but now there are no more codpieces. His devotion to chastity seems ridiculous. But let's understand and let's contextualize Mr. Milton. Who would not rest satisfied with his hintings at good and evil in the Paradise Lost when just free from the Inquisition and burning in Smithfield? The Reformation produced such immediate and great benefits that Protestantism was considered under the immediate eye of heaven. And its own remaining dogmas and superstitions then, as it were, regenerated, constituted those resting places and seeming sure points of reasoning. From that I have mentioned, Milton, whatever he may have thought in the sequel, Paradise Regained, he did not, appears to have been content with these by his writings. He did not think into the human heart, as Wordsworth has done. Yet Milton, as a philosopher, had sure as great powers as Wordsworth. What is then to assume, or to be inferred? Oh, many things. It proves there is really a grand march of intellect. It proves that a mighty providence subdues the mightiest minds to the service of the time being, the zeitgeist. Whether it be human knowledge or religion, I have often pitied a tutor who has to hear Nome Musa, so he's learning Latin by rote, so often dinned into his ears. I hope you may not have the same pain with this scribbling. I may have read these things before, but I had never had even a thus dim perception of them, and moreover, I like to say my own lesson to one who will endure my tediousness for my own sake. After all, there is certainly something real in the world, etc., etc. But now you get, and he says, finally, the truth, there is something real in the world. Your third chamber of life shall be a lucky and gentle one, stored with the wine of love and the bread of friendship. So there's the third chamber. But those first two, so he's talking about human life as a series of emancipation and of growing light. In the same way, he sees history in the same understanding. And Wordsworth is superior to Milton insofar as he's got rid of the temporary resting place for the human intellect, its belief in a Christian system of salvation and so forth, which he said was necessary for a while, but now we've moved beyond that. And now Wordsworth goes beyond that dogma of a religious system to the subject of Wordsworth's poetry, the mind of man, or the human heart. Anyway, so Keats is reflecting, I would say, Wordsworth's own views here and Shelley's views and so forth. Do you think Coleridge agreed with that based on what we read? I'm not convinced by that, but it's possible. Because he still regards Wordsworth as a great poet, as a genius, as capturing something, but he thinks it's true, has been true of all poetry throughout all ages, and Wordsworth thinks, no, it's the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, and all good poetry is this. And therefore it has these certain features, and Coleridge simply begs to differ, but maybe Coleridge is just quibbling, and they're in general agreement. There's a ongoing enlightenment going on. Anyway, you comment, Joseph?
Yeah, like if we follow this interpretation, who would be the spirit of art in North America, in Western thought, in poetry right now, that's in the English tradition?
So what he's described here, so I've the romantic exposition of this, whether you want to take Wordsworth's or Keats or Shelley's or Byron's or any of the figures of the period, what they articulate in their literary theory soon gets put down and entrenched into the academic discipline. This is the beginning of the Geist des Wissenschaften. Sorry for the clearing my throat. Or Geist is spirit, the spiritual sciences, or as they're called in English, the human sciences. And in that, the academic discipline, the humanities are there to bring the same progress in the human and religious realm that we find in the natural realm of science. So scientific discoveries give rise to great advances in our understanding of the natural world. The Geisteswissenschaften are wishing and claiming to be able to do the same thing in the humanities. So there's an inherent sense of the possibility of the progress of the human spirit through the humanities. So now the humanities are no longer preserving and articulating a human essence that doesn't change, in which the past is on the same playing field as the present, but rather it looks at humanity as on an upward climb. And it began in murky origins at the back end of history with just inarticulate grunts and cries and savagery and men with clubs beating women and dragging them around by the hair, of which there's no evidence whatsoever, by the way. But this general portrait, why men are dragging women around by the hair and not the other way around. Maybe the women want to be dragged around by the hair. I mean, who knows? If they're inarticulate brutes, why wouldn't they want to be dragged around by the hair? I don't know. I mean, that's the portrait. I'm sorry.
Had your hair long
I guess. Well, but did the men get their hair cut? I mean, don't look at me. I mean, my hair is not a good illustration of this, but men can grow long hair as well. Men are stronger. Oh, so it's the might, it's the physical strength of the men that means them drag around because they don't have any rules, right? It's just brute. Okay, but I'm giving you the caveman theory, right? And that's how the early origins, and people fight, and basically the strong man is the man who is the king, right? But there's this grand march of the intellect in which it begins very physical and it gets more and more spiritual, more and more intellectual. It's the age of science and the progress of the Geist. And the modern romantic hermeneutics is there to capture exactly that. And again, Schleiermacher will say that we can know as well, if not better, than the men of the past. So we know what Jesus said. We know what Paul said. And we understand what they said, but we know it better than them. Why do we know it better than them? Because of the grand march of the intellect. Because we can see with historical distance, where their biases are. And we don't have those biases anymore. We've moved beyond them. And now we don't have any biases after all. We're inclusive. This is what he's talking about. This is very much contemporary stuff. So what was called good and evil in the past, we're beyond good and evil, to use Nietzsche's phrase. And Nietzsche's very much in keeping with this. And it's for the Übermensch then, in Nietzsche's terminology, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, to keep on climbing upwards for the sake of humanity. It's portrayed in Shelley's Frankenstein as the man of science and the man of poetry both go down that path. And one turns back, the man of poetry. But this is what he's describing. He's saying that Wordsworth is superior to Milton. What he's not sure about is it because he is the product of his age. Is he a product of the Zeitgeist? The word Zeit in German means time, the time, the spirit of the times. Or is it because he's genuinely, as an individual, superior? That's the debate. But he's quite clear that he is superior insofar as he looks deeper within the human heart. Does he really? That's Keats' estimation. And the mark of it is that he has thrown off superstition and religious bias. So that's the thing that distinguishes his superiority to Milton, is that he no longer operates under biases. He has no prejudices. Or to use the phrase rather that Gadamer used to describe Kant, he has a prejudice against prejudice, does Keats. He thinks that prejudice is evil, but this is his prejudice. It's just a universal prejudice. So it's blind. It's not blind. It's not prejudice against one thing. It's prejudice against all things. And all things being physical. So he's promoting a spirituality of a non-physical nature, while at the same time saying that he is very much of an experiential being, and it's only based on experience. Keats is vastly influential on the intellectual fabric of the academy, I would say, as much as Wordsworth and Coleridge are, and to a lesser extent, though more recently, of Shelley. I think Keats is also so. Very, very influential on later writers. And they will agree with his assessment here. Now, so he also goes on. What will I go here? I'll go to Richard Woodhouse, October 27th, 1818. Does anyone have a further comment about that or a question, observation? What did I say? Who knows what I said? I said October 27th, 1818. So I'll stick it up here for you. October 20th, Richard Woodhouse. That can't be right. There it is. My dear Woodhouse. Lost it. My dear Woodhouse, your letter gave me a great satisfaction. I'll skip all over that. The beginning of this, and he's about genius. And as to the poetical character itself, fifth line down, I mean that sort, of which if I am anything, I am a member. That sort distinguished from the Wordsworthian or egotistical sublime. Famous phrase. Which is a thing per se and stands alone. So now he's mocking Wordsworth. He admires Wordsworth, but at the same time, Wordsworth seems to retreat from personal experience, and that he's reflecting on himself all over the place. I think it's an apt critique, actually. Which is a thing per se and stands alone. It is not itself. It has no self. It is everything and nothing. It has no character. It enjoys light and shade. It lives in gusto, be it foul or fair, high or low, rich or poor, mean or elevated. It has as much delight in conceiving an Iago as an Imogen. Now that's Shakespeare. That's Keats. Keats sees himself in Shakespeare's light. He's not going to impose his own ego on it, whereas Wordsworth does. He says what shocks the virtuous philosopher delights the chameleon poet. Just little phrases are connected to Keats. It does no harm from its relish of the dark side of things any more than from its taste for the bright one, because they both end in speculation. A poet is the most unpoetical thing of anything in existence, because he has no identity. He is continually in for and filling some other body. The sun, the moon, the sea, and men and women who are creatures of impulse are poetical and have about them an unchangeable attribute. The poet has none, no identity. He is certainly the most unpoetical of all God's creatures. If then he has no self, and if I am a poet, where is the wonder that I should say, I would write no more? Might I not at the very instant have been cogitating on the characters of Saturn and Ops? It's a wretched thing to confess. Note this negation of self. He talked about it in relation to Shakespeare. He talks about it in relation to himself. It is a sign of the progress of the Geist that it gets rid of the identity, and it moves in the direction of, and this was my suggestion. I'm not getting it from the authors themselves, but I'm connecting the dots. They have a new view of human nature, and it's an organic one. They see themselves as organisms. Organisms, again, have a sensitivity. They don't think. They react. The environment, if you prick an amoeba, it jolts. It responds to it. They also take in food. They ingest it, digest. To be slightly vulgar, the mouth and the anus are the same thing. Comes in and out the same. Like there's a constant interaction. There isn't an agency. There's no thought. There's no preconceived plan. There's no telos to the action. They simply live and survive. Keats's view of artistic creativity seems to have no agency that imposes itself. It simply receives everything around it and represents it whole. It doesn't swallow, digest, assimilate anything. It just takes it in and puts it back out. That, he suggests, is the poetical character. It has no identity. And that is, again, a mark, go back to what I said from Shelley's letter, if you're interested, on life. He talks about that in relation to words as well. So those words, I, you, he, they, are not real distinguishing marks of identity. They are simply names that we use, common associations, conventions, but there's not anything. There's no real personal differences. So they're both going in the same direction in the name of a spirituality, but it's a spirituality divorced from a concept of human identity. So now it moves in more in the direction of Eastern religion. Romanticism and Eastern religion have a lot in common. And it's probably not accidental that at this point the Eastern world receives a far different reception in the West than it had before, far more sympathetic. And not just sympathetic, regarding the Eastern religious traditions to be more true than the Western tradition, from which they come and to which they owe their intellectual parentage. There's a move towards that, and I don't think it goes away. I think it's still in the academy. Modern psychology is of that sort. So is sociology. And they talk about human rights, but without being able to identify what a human being is. Do I have any time? I got 5 minutes. I'll come to one final one. This is from the letter to, there's a whole series of authors he packed. So this is to George and Georgiana Keats, my dear brother and sister. And it's in 1819. This will be towards the end of his life. In May, by the time he sends his last letter here, he probably realizes tuberculosis is coming. Watched his brother die of it, and now he's writing on it. So this is April 21st, 1819. I'll see if I can find it here. And he's now speculating on life and it's where it will go. Where did I just say? There it is. And it's really long because it's a whole series. He must have sent them in a package. See if I can find them here. April. Nope, too far. Late March. Oh, this is going to be a problem. I might not be able to find it. I'll just read it to you. Where shall I begin? Let the fish philosophize the ice away from the rivers in wintertime, and they shall be at continual play in the tepid delight of summer. Look at the poles and the sands of Africa, whirlpools and volcanoes. Let men exterminate them, and I will say that they may arrive at earthly happiness. The point at which man may arrive is as far as the parallel state in inanimate nature and no further, just removing material want and hardship. For instance, suppose a rose to have sensation. It blooms on a beautiful morning, it enjoys itself, but there comes a cold wind, a hot sun, it cannot escape it, it cannot destroy its annoyances. They are as native to the world as itself. No more can man be happy in spite the worldly elements will prey upon his nature. The common cognomen of this world among the misguided and superstitious is, quote, a veil of tears, end quote, from which we are to be redeemed by a certain arbitrary interposition of God and taken to heaven. You know who he's talking about. This is the Christian dogma here. What a little circumscribed, straitened notion. Call the world, if you please, quote, the veil of soul-making, unquote. Then you will find out the use of the world. I'm speaking now in the highest terms for human nature, admitting it to be immortal, which I will here take for granted for the purpose of showing a thought which has struck me concerning it. I say soul-making. Soul is distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligences or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities. Remember, he said he didn't have an identity, but they acquire an identity. How do they get an identity? They get an identity when they become personally themselves. So they acquire identities till each one is personally itself. Intelligences are atoms of perception. They know and they see and they are pure. In short, they are God. How then are souls to be made? How then are these sparks, which are God, to have identity given them, so as ever to possess a bliss peculiar to each one's individual existence? Well, how? But by the medium of a world like this. So we're all God, and yet we have no identity, and we get the identity through the experience of suffering, which is soul-making. We have no soul. We develop a soul. Soul comes from experience. This point I sincerely wish to consider because I think it a grander system of salvation than the Christian religion. Or rather, it is a system of spirit creation. This is affected by three grand materials acting the one upon the other for a series of years. These three materials are the intelligence, the human heart, and the world or elemental space suited for the proper action of mind and heart on each other for the purpose of forming the soul or intelligence destined to possess the sense of identity. I can scarcely express what I but dimly perceive, and yet I think I perceive it. That you may judge the more clearly, I will put it in the most homely form possible. I will call the world a school, instituted for the purpose of teaching little children to read. I would call the human heart the horn book used in that school. So a horn book is a primer that's used to learn grammar and so forth, covering by a transparent horn. And I will call the child able to read the soul made from that school and its horn book. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? So it begins as intelligence, and suffering makes it a soul. So he's answering the problem of pain. The answer to the problem of pain is necessary to make souls, but they're not souls before the pain. So he's giving what he's effectively doing. My comment, and then I guess we're going to have to conclude here, is he's giving divinity to evil, because he's effectively saying that the evil experiences make it a soul, is giving a generative capacity to evil and a formative capacity. He's not saying that evil is something that needs to be accounted for. He is saying that evil is his good. Right? If you become an intelligent, then you become a soul, and the soul is a good thing, and the pain is a good thing. It's a good thing because then you develop your identity. Not merely is the heart a horn book, it is the mind's Bible. It is the mind's experience. It is the teat from which the mind or intelligence sucks its identity. Very evocative, very poetic. And again, if you're interested in that, I only alluded to it and had to break it off. It's in the letter to George and Georgiana Keats, February 14th to May 3rd. There's just a whole series of letters. I've only taken a snippet out of it. But you get a sense of where that is going and how it emphasizes the importance of experience then as soul formation. And I want you to take that and think about it and then compare it and contrast it with the view that Plato and Aristotle had, where a soul is something you have, right? It's not something you create, it's something you have. And it's inside a body, and the body is the prison house for the soul. And then you move to Keats, whereas the body is the necessary, sensational realm, the way you perceive beauty, and yet we also suffer through that, and we develop a soul in that. And then take that and then look at the application for bioethical issues. What is the implication for that for abortion? What is it for euthanasia? Is that a soul? Is there the essence of a person being killed if infanticide, like never mind abortion, infanticide, if you've not yet developed a soul is developed along the way. I can tell you contemporary bioethicists like Peter Singer have exactly Keats's view and justify infanticide on that basis because they don't have souls yet. Yes, they are clearly human beings. Genetically, it's indisputable, but they're not yet souls. They don't have a soul yet. They'll develop one. And so it's an organic view of life, and it still wants to hold on to the idea of something distinct being, but the distinctness comes later. It's not inherent in the creature. I think it's deeply problematic. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.